Welcome to Satluj TV News Special. I'm Angus Scott in London. So over recent months, the issue of fake news has reached a head. A tsunami of propaganda has swept across social media, and several high-profile Sikh campaigners have been killed or indeed died under suspicious circumstances in Canada, the UK and Pakistan. And all of this provoking accusations that India is dividing its communities more than ever before. So to help us take a bit more of an informed look at these issues, I'm joined today by a former US Congressman, a gentleman no stranger to India, or indeed the issues currently raging between North America and India. A congressman for 14 years and a passionate defender of human rights, former chairman of the Religious Freedom Caucus and senior member of the US government's India Caucus, which actually took him to India, allowing him to meet then Prime Minister Sri Atal Bihari Vajpayee. A man of deep conviction himself, his focus was not just promoting religious freedom in India, but also ensuring the basic human rights of religious minorities in the country were respected. Congressman Trent Franks, welcome. Thank you for joining us today.
Well, thank you for inviting me, Angus. I always appreciate your presentation. I appreciate how you articulate things, and it's just a sweet honor to be on the program with you.
Thank you very much indeed. So, let me ask you, Congressman, only a few days ago, Human Rights Watch publicly warned that India was, and I quote their very own words, drifting into authoritarianism. That's quite a statement. So is Narendra Modi genuinely a threat to democracy?
Well, anytime any government drifts into a tyrannical ideal that they will somehow control people's religious expression or persecute them on the basis of their religious persuasion, it is a profound danger. You said earlier, I thought so well, religious freedom it's the foundation of all other freedoms, Angus, and it's vital for human society to elevate that in the most significant way. Because if government, whether it be the Indian government or any government, can proceed to persecute people on the basis of their faith, then there's really nothing government cannot do, and it becomes a pure tyranny of the first order.
So, developing that a little bit further, I mean, there are several basic tenets of a modern democracy that I suppose we take for granted in the West. These include things like the freedom of expression, the freedom to protest, and of course a free press. Now, the World Press Freedom Index recently demoted India to 161st out of 180 countries. Now, that's only a few points up from North Korea of all places. Now, in the world's largest democracy, what is going wrong?
Well, Angus, the Indian government does often tout itself as the world's largest democracy. And what all of us forget is that a pure democracy is in no way a guarantee of religious freedom and human rights, since we're all at that point subject to the arbitrary will of the majority. Religious freedom and basic human rights must be recognized throughout the world as fundamental and inviolable, or to use the term of our founding fathers in America, unalienable. So I think that the Indian government should be profoundly concerned that they find themselves rated as so low in this standing for religious freedom, because religious freedom is the most basic of all freedoms. If you have religious freedom, all other freedoms will follow. But if we remove religious freedom from society, then all other freedoms will eventually collapse. It is an issue of profound gravity for the Indian government and for really the governments throughout the world.
But I suppose if we look at Narendra Modi himself, I mean, he has an incredibly difficult job to do. I mean, India is a hugely diverse nation. I mean, it has over 122 different major languages alone. So trying to unite his country under one flag, it is obviously a very difficult thing to do. In your own experience representing the US government in the region, what is the Indian government doing that makes you feel particularly that minorities are not getting this fair deal?
Well, the most important thing to realize, Angus, is the smallest minority in all of society is the individual. And of course, in America, we celebrate every individual's God-given right to life, liberty, and property. And when you focus everything on just a minority or majority concept where they are warring against each other, it's very easy then for the majority to crush the rights of the minority. And the very central core of human liberty is religious freedom. And it is a great tragedy that's sweeping our world, whereby governments and elitists in government or otherwise are trying to divide humanity along the boundaries of faith, or race, or gender, or national origin. And this is just Marxism rebranded. And Marxism is in itself a religion, even though, Karl Marx turned atheist in his early life, but he was a far more theologian than he was an economist. And unfortunately, the world doesn't really understand that. But he sought to destroy any religious conviction that God existed. And that is so significant because in America, we recognize in our Declaration of Independence that our rights come from God. And then when you take God out of the equation, the idea that we are created in his image, if you take that out of the equation, you destroy the security of any inherent human dignity or human rights. So it becomes vitally important that we recognize the individual and that these are God-given rights that should be afforded to any individual in our society or our country. And when India forgets that, they make a terrible mistake.
I think there's an interesting point that you touched upon there about the religious majority. India is 80% Hindu majority. And all sorts of accusations about the government, the BJP government, favouring the Hindu majority, and policy making is obviously more in Hindu interests. There are accusations that Narendra Modi, over recent days and weeks, has been doing a bit of a world tour. He was in the US recently, shaking the hand of President Joe Biden. Over the weekend, he was meeting President Macron. Now, both countries, the US and France, for example, are a long way down the road of signing huge commercial deals with India, selling jets, technology, all sorts of very lucrative deals in hand. Is it feasible? Bear in mind what we know about the governance in India and this majority Hindu prejudice, shall we call it. Are we in danger of brushing human rights under the carpet for the sake of simple economics?
Well, I could not express in stronger terms that I believe that is exactly the danger. India's Hindu majority government is still, has latent and echoes of the caste system that is still practiced, whether or not it's their official policy or not. When you consider their human rights record with the Dalits or the Sikh people, it is a disgrace. And India needs to recognize that the rest of the world sees that. And I want to say something here that I think is very important. I believe it is in the heart of the vast majority of the people of India to recognize human rights of their brothers and sisters, regardless of their faith or ethnicity. But unfortunately, their government has still not assimilated that message sufficiently. And when we stand by and ignore these very real persecutions and very real overriding of the rights of whether it's the Dalits or the Sikh people, we're making a mistake for the human family in the entire world. If we don't recognize each person as an individual that has the God-given rights of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness or property or those kinds of things, then we ultimately throw the log up the trail for great conflict between ourselves in the future, because the human soul is just bound and determined and was, in my judgment, created to be free. And that's especially important when it comes to religious expression and religious freedom. And if we fail in that regard, nothing else will suffice.
Powerful words. But do you think, coming back to the central point here, do you think, we've seen President Biden shaking hands very warmly with the Prime Minister of India. And in the press conference, the joint press conference, even the first question that was asked by a journalist from the Wall Street Journal was questioning Prime Minister Modi about his record of human rights, which he gave a very, I suppose, a very reasonable answer on the face of it, a very political answer. Do you think that President Biden, behind the scenes, is having quiet words with Prime Minister Modi about these issues? Do you think it is being raised at all?
Well, Angus, I would like to tell you that the answer to that question is yes, but I would unfortunately be doubtful. I had the dubious distinction of serving with Joe Biden when he was in the Congress and I was in the Congress. We overlapped for about 6 years. I was there 15. And I will tell you, I've never seen Joe Biden really go to the wall for any principle based on its principle, based on the conviction in his own heart this was the right thing to do. It was always a political calculation. And I'm desperately afraid that that's what he's done now, that there's a political calculation, and he feels like, that it's best for him just to ignore human rights violations and to do everything that they can to encourage economic involvement between America and India. And I will say to you, I understand the need for that, but we need, first of all, to be faithful to our humanity. We need to be faithful to our brothers and sisters in the human family, as I say. And if we stand by in the name of economics and ignore basic human rights violations, we make a terrible mistake. I'm worried, too, that when the Biden administration expresses such weakness in a situation like this, the Indian government says, well, we have nothing to worry about there. We can cozy up to Russia. We can do whatever we want to do. And they then make a mistake on the part of India as well, because it is a natural alliance that India and the United States should be working together against the coalition between Russia and China. But it's critically important that we come together on this human rights issue, and that any persecution of people in India, or for that much America, for that matter America, that we should do everything we can to prevent any kind of persecution of religious minorities based on their religious conviction. It is a one way to nowhere.
You raise a very interesting point there, bringing in, should we say, the bigger picture, the global geopolitics element to this. Of course, human rights, we in the West find that whole area a very powerful argument. But is there an element of real politic here? We know India historically has very close ties to Moscow, to Tehran. It has a land border with China, and it obviously has its own local issues with China. There's been a flaring of tensions in recent years. But India is also playing quite a clever game. They are playing off the West, they're playing off Russia, China against each other to their own advantage. Now, we can't blame India for that. It's obviously they're playing the game in their own interest. But what it does mean for us in the West, obviously, as you've alluded to, we need to court India as an ally to provide some form of regional buttress against the growing belligerence of China. But is there danger in the context of what we know about India's historic relationships? Is there a danger further down the line at some critical point in the future? Could we trust India as an ally? Is there a danger they could betray us at some critical point, and by extension NATO?
Boy, you ask a very challenging question. I would say this much, that if India thinks that China will be their friend in the long run, they are terribly wrong. And if somehow they are upset with America for pointing out their obvious human rights violations in their country, they forget that the same impulse in our souls and hearts that motivate us to protect individual human rights for religious minorities there, whether it's the Muslim minorities in India, which I think are about 14%, or the Sikh or the Christian minorities there, which are hover around 2% apiece. If we don't protect them, then why would we ultimately protect each other? I wish we could understand that when we don't have the courage to stand up for the least among us, in the final analysis, we are not a good partner to anyone. And if we somehow overlook human rights violations, it speaks to a greater issue in our own hearts that goes directly to the idea of loyalty among allies. And America must stand for protecting these minorities in our own country and certainly in India. And we need to stand up to the Modi government or any other government that doesn't take that seriously. And if we do that, that in a sense is a basis of trust that we're going to stick to principle. And one of the great principles is that we stand together against a nation like China, who, in my judgment, is the greatest danger in the world to religious freedom and to human rights. And they are a monster that is coming, and we have to absolutely stand together to prevent that. In the meantime, we have to have our own house in order, and that means recognizing the religious freedom of every group in India and America and really the whole world. That doesn't mean we have to agree with them. That doesn't mean we can't debate it, but we absolutely need to recognize religious freedom, because without it, a human society is lost.
Yeah, and it's an interesting comparison with China. Obviously, one of the most authoritarian regimes on the planet. They
Yes.
are now the second most populous country after India, who recently overtook China in terms of population. And it's very clear that when we look decades into the future, there are two new superpowers. It's China and India. China has this very authoritarian regime, a population, I would venture to say, are very cowed in terms of how they have to live their lives. But India comes from a very democratic background. It comes from a completely different cultural background. And yet in recent years, this accusation that it is drifting into authoritarianism, is there a concern that Prime Minister Modi is following a bit of a Chinese model here? Maybe is it a taste of power? Is it a taste of complete control? We're seeing very divisive politics going on. In terms of practical steps from us in the West, with our very mature democracies, are there any practical steps that we can take just to warn Prime Minister Modi, look, you either go down the China route or you go down the West route? What sort of messages could we send India?
Well, I think we need to ask the question, Prime Minister Modi, do you want to be friends with the United States, who throughout our history has stood for human rights and for recognizing the freedom of other nations, and that we've shown a commitment to that across the world, where we have sacrificed our blood and treasure to protect peoples that are under persecution? Do you want to stand with a partner like us, or do you want to stand with a partner like China, who has demonstrated their authoritarian, complete, malicious, malevolent attitude towards any sort of human autonomy that doesn't comport to the CCP's ideology? India has to make that choice. And I would suggest to you that if they drift in the other way, that they not only harm the people within their own country, but they harm their standing in the world, and ultimately they harm their own government and put themselves at great disadvantage, where at some point a country like China may exert such influence in the world that it would be a crushing assault against all of humanity.
Yeah, I think maybe to sum it up, these things never end well historically, as we've seen over and over. So, OK, if I may, Congressman, I'd like to just drill down into a few more specific areas and referring to recent events. This year alone, 4 high-profile Sikh campaigners have been killed or died under suspicious circumstances. In response to that, Sikh organisations in Canada and here in the UK have openly accused the Indian government of being behind these killings, so it's quite an accusation. Just the other day, Indian TV Today network apparently referred to a hit list of 20 Sikhs living internationally, whatever hit list means in any ambiguous sort of sense. Yeah. But in the context of that, do you think these accusations that there could be some Indian government involvement in these killings be unreasonable?
Well, no, I think it's very reasonable to look at this very closely. And people like me would be very alert to any assassination or unexplained killings of Sikhs or other religious minorities in America or anywhere. And I can only assure you, in the strongest possible terms, if those things would ever occur here in this country, we will leave no stone unturned to seek out and expose and bring to justice any individual or group or government that would stoop to assassinating religious and political dissidents living in the United States for their own political ends. And I can't say this in strong enough terms. I mean, I would hope that the Indian government would never be unwise enough to surreptitiously or be behind any killings of religious dissidents in other countries. But if that should ever happen in America, we will run it to ground, and we will make sure that we expose those that are the perpetrators. And this is crossing a line that can't be crossed. I hope they would not be that unwise in their own thinking, because it is a profound concern to us, and it would awaken America in a very big way. It certainly would awaken those of us that have fought so long for religious freedom in America and across the world.
I would say that Western nations, and particularly the US, is probably one of the prime examples of this, of operating internationally in clandestine methods, covert operations. If the NIA, the National Investigation Agency of India, are involved in the US in whatever capacity, how can we firstly legitimately call it out if we are up to the same sort of thing? And if we do, practically speaking, again, it's a big accusation to make. It's always very hard to prove. And of course, there was the diplomatic angles to this, where obviously it is very hard to openly accuse a foreign government of clandestine operations. But in practical terms, what could the US government do about this if they did find something? And I'm looking at this from two angles. I mean, firstly, on US domestic soil, there is physical and psychological intimidation, arguably, or there is the allegations of that. But there's also a lot of remote intimidation coming from within India against members of the Sikh community, other Indian minority communities on the US soil. So in practical terms, what could the US government do about this? What protection could they provide?
Well, without being clear on exactly how they would proceed in that regard, and again, I'm hoping that the Indian government would not be so terribly deceived as to move forward like that, and without knowing exactly what they've done, let me suggest to you that there's a lot of things we could do, especially if we had someone in the White House that had the courage of American conviction. This would mean, I believe, an interruption of diplomatic and economic relations between our two countries. And if they should take someone that is under our protectorate, it would have the gravest consequences. There are a lot of things that we can do, whether it's economically or informationally or diplomatically or just in terms of sanctions. There's just so many things that we can do. We must not, and by the grace of God, will not ever stand by and let people in the United States of America be assassinated for their religious conviction. As long as they are not breaking the law in the United States, as long as they're not doing something to harm others, we will not stand by and let anyone be persecuted or assassinated in this country. Now, I realize that with the present government of the United States, we've lost a lot of credibility on that ground because we've unfortunately allowed the woke ideology here to completely erase the basis of all human continuity, and that is the idea that we are all created equal, and we shouldn't divide ourselves among racial or gender lines or these kinds of things. But the point is that we need to be strong when it comes to protecting any people on the basis of being able to express openly their religious conviction. And if we should ever see any kind of assassination of those individuals come to America, like I say, people like me, people like many of the folks in our government that are committed to religious freedom would respond in the most significant and firm ways possible.
It's a very binary, a very black and white argument, of which I think very few people would disagree with that. The waters are somewhat muddied. There are shades of grey, and the common tactic that we've seen from the Indian government has been to blanket label legitimate political protesters, particularly Khalistani Sikhs, as terrorists. Now, by labelling a person a terrorist, it allows much greater scope from a legal capacity in terms of it lowers most of the legal thresholds to detain somebody. Most of the normal legal protections afforded to anybody are much lower. The thresholds are lowered once you label them a terrorist. And of course, we in the West are very vociferous in our actions against terrorists. And we likewise are very robust in our actions against those we call terrorists. Now, bearing in mind, the oft thrown out defence is one man's terrorist is another man's freedom fighter. Are we operating double standards here in the West?
Well, I've heard that phrase many times, but Angus, there is a difference between people that are freedom fighters. There are people that are expressing their views openly and within the bounds of human decency, and those that are killing innocent people to create terror in society to either gain attention or gain acceptance of their ideology. There's a great difference. Terrorists stand by and ignore humanity and are willing to kill innocents. They're willing to create violence and do those things that are completely outside the rubric of human debate or honest differences. So I think that's a kind of a red herring. We know the difference between a terrorist and someone that is expressing their religious freedom or expressing their political viewpoints. And when it comes to expressing political viewpoints, if there is no threat involved, If there is no promise of some type of violence or taking other people's rights away in the process, people have a right to express their point of view. And when governments use the terrorist label to go after those kinds of people, they themselves become sort of a terrorist element. And it is something that we need to be very specific and make the proper divisions and the proper the proper discriminating understanding of the difference between, we need to discriminate between terrorism and freedom. There are great differences.
And I think that's a very pertinent point, particularly north of your border in Canada, where Justin Trudeau has, at the moment, a relatively abrasive relationship with India, particularly because there is the largest Sikh diaspora in Canada. I think there's about 750,000 Sikhs resident in Canada. And of course, many of them are on the streets protesting legitimately. They have very vocal protests in the streets, lots of banners, lots of car convoys, but they are legitimate political protests. And of course, we're seeing, particularly on social media and from many sources from India, that people are labelling these people, the Khalistanis, as terrorists, which, as you've said very clearly, they are not. But let me come back to what the US, obviously this is south of the Canadian border now, but what the US can practically do about this sort of problem, because it may well arise in the States in the foreseeable future. The US has often been labelled the policeman of the world because it has a very robust stance, as we said, on human rights, particularly in various regions of the world. And wherever the US has seen human rights trampled upon, they've acted very aggressively and quite often backed it with military force. And Iraq and Afghanistan, prime examples of that. Now, when we look at India, obviously military force is hopefully not on the table here, but what practical action, and coming back to, again, stopping political protests and intimidation of political protests and labelling protesters as terrorists, what practical action can the US government take to protect legitimate political protests in the US aimed at India?
Well, first of all, we need to have the courage to suggest that we will take action if these things occur. We need to make it very clear and not gloss over that in the name of political, hegemony or sort of trying to work together for the good of all and just ignore the human rights violations that occur. We need to be very clear on that. And well, you mentioned Prime Minister Trudeau. I'm going to be very direct. I think Prime Minister Trudeau is an embarrassment to humanity. This man has taken a great country like Canada and has completely led it off into the dark, where the ideals of individual human freedom and human rights are subordinate to this woke insanity that seems to be engulfing the world. I want to say to him that this remains, that woke nonsense will finally run its course, and people will see the sheer stupidity and the sheer inhumanity of the woke ideal that would divide us all among racial and gender lines and religious lines, and somehow gain short-term political leverage. But we will, as a people, as a human family, we will finally see through that terrible deception. And then people like Prime Minister Trudeau will be left with a place in history that sees them as just another demagogue that didn't stand up for the true cause of human freedom and human dignity. And as a leader of a government, that's a pretty bad place to be, because, ultimately we shouldn't look just to the next election. We should look to the next generation and look to what we really did in this world that made a difference for those that might otherwise never have had a chance.
Well, that raises up a very different angle to this, because of course most people globally, and particularly in India, form their views, their opinions based on what they see and what news they are fed. And of course, as we've seen in India, India has its own state media. A lot of particularly younger generation get their news and their information from places like YouTube on the internet. Now, the Indian state does operate several outlets which are clearly heavily biased towards a very Hindu agenda and increasingly feed an anti-minority message. Now, most countries' media is often accused of being partisan or pro-government, but why do you think India is so different?
Well, I mean, I would suggest to you that fake news is something that's rearing its head all over the world, and that maybe there are groups or individuals or forces in India that have especially latched onto it as a tactic. But as a people, we're going to have to recognize that if the journalism community or the so-called journalistic community has devolved so much into fake news, we're going to have to demand accountability and begin to think for ourselves in a more significant way, because you know, it's not what you don't know that hurts you so badly. It's what you do know that is not true. And the media is unfortunately they're culpable in a lot of that tragedy, where people believe in something sincerely and it turns out not to be true, and consequently their actions turned out to be misdirected. So I would say to you that the concern that we should all have for media distortion is absolutely gigantic on the horizon, and we need to make sure that we, as a people, take it seriously, because it has the ability to devolve our society into sort of a Sumerian night where the survival of the fittest has prevailed over humanity, you know?
Yeah, and I think certainly with recent events, the amount of fake news being spread around is shocking and quite concerning, particularly in areas of the West where we take a free press for granted. And it's clear, particularly relating to news about India and the diaspora of the Sikhs, for example, there is a very deep imbalance in news reporting. And of course, it is dominated by Hindu-operated and more Hindu interest outlets. Even our own channel, for example, Satluj, we are blocked in India. So is there anything, again, coming back to practical steps, how can we firstly get our message out to, well, the wider world, but also into India itself? Can we pressure the Indian government? What steps can we take?
Well, I think we can. I think there are things on the micro basis, like related to media. And for instance, the Satluj network has been a shining light in being able to express some of the views of the minority Sikh community and others, and they're definitely dedicated to religious freedom on a basic and fundamental level for everyone. And that's important, but we need to tell India, listen, if you're going to block those people out, we will do everything that we can to find ways to see those conduits of information be able to come into India. And at some point, if you continue to do that, like we do with economic trade, if you won't let our media in, we won't let yours in. And there are some basic things that we can do. But I'm convinced that if we have a president in America that will simply say, listen, America is not the policeman of the world, but we are dedicated to protecting the innocent. We are dedicated to protecting religious freedom. We're dedicated to protecting human rights and the basic hope of human freedom in general. Because we know that if human freedom does not thrive in the world, that at some point it is a threat to our own children and grandchildren. And because we see it as such a gift, that we will not stand idly by and let it be desecrated, and more importantly, the people that are the victims of that desecration face it alone. And my contention is that if we stand up and are principled and have a handout of friendship to everyone, and that we are not an enemy to anyone, but those who would try to overcome basic human rights or somehow threaten the United States militarily, will not prevail. If we can express that in a straightforward way that's believable and credible, I think we can have a great impact in the world.
Very powerful message to finish with. Congressman Trent Franks, it's been a pleasure and an honour speaking with you today. Thank you for joining us.
Angus, it was my pleasure. Take care, sir.
Thank you.